there's a microscopic ghost haunting the veins of 15% of the human population. A missing piece of biological architecture, an empty space on the surface of billions of red blood cells where a highly complex evolutionary marker ought to be. It is an absence that leaves no physical scar, causes no daily pain, and remains completely invisible to the naked eye. Yet, this tiny cellular void holds the echoes of an ancient, forgotten journey. The world outside your window has gone quiet. The sharp edges of the day have softened into shadows, and the ambient hum of traffic and waking life has faded into the slow, rhythmic breathing of the night. The temperature drops just a fraction of a degree, the air settling still over the streets and the trees, matching the steady slowing of your own pulse. You can feel the gravity pulling you down into the mattress, a gentle, invisible tether, keeping you grounded while your mind begins to detach from the immediate pressures of the waking hours. We are taught early on that the story of our species is a relatively straightforward ascent, a continuous, forward-moving accumulation of biological upgrades, perfectly tuned to conquer the earth. What if I told you that written into the deep, silent archives of human DNA, there's a sudden, inexplicable erasure, a mutation so biologically counterintuitive that it historically caused the human immune system to turn against its own future, yet somehow survived the brutal, unforgiving gauntlet of natural selection to flow through the veins of millions of people living tonight. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So get comfortable, maybe subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, all experiencing the same mystery together. Right now, as you lie in the quiet dark, your heart is performing an act of quiet, rhythmic engineering. With every beat, it pushes roughly 5 liters of a complex, iron-rich fluid through a network of vessels that, if laid end to end, would wrap around the earth more than twice. This crimson river is your most vital internal ocean, carrying oxygen to the farthest reaches of your extremities, sweeping away the microscopic debris of living and maintaining the exact internal temperature needed to keep you alive. For millennia, our ancestors looked at this red fluid and saw pure metaphor. They saw the soul. They saw vital life force, inherited courage, the literal manifestation of family lineage and divine right. Kings waged wars over the supposed purity of their bloodlines, and ancient physicians attempted to balance the body's humors by draining it away into brass bowls. They did not know and could not possibly see the staggering, complex machinery operating at the cellular level. If we drift downward, shrinking our perspective from the vast, sprawling map of human civilization down to the microscopic architecture of a single drop of blood, we enter an entirely different universe. Here, the red blood cell, the erythrocyte, floats like a flexible, biconcave disc in a pale yellow sea of plasma. Its surface is not perfectly smooth. It is covered in a dense, microscopic forest of proteins and complex carbohydrates. These structures are antigens. They are the chemical name tags, the microscopic identifiers that the body's security system, the immune system, reads to determine what belongs to you and what is a foreign invader. Most of the human population carries a very specific, highly recognizable protein embedded in this cellular forest. It is a protein that serves as a molecular flag, signaling a deeply rooted evolutionary connection. We call this the D antigen, the primary factor in what is known as the rhesus blood group system. When a person possesses this protein, their blood is typed as positive. 85% of the Earth's population carries this marker. It is a biological standard, a widely shared genetic signature that unites the vast majority of humanity across continents, across cultures, and across the deep chasms of time. Then there is the anomaly, the negative. To have Rh negative blood is not to possess a different type of protein. It is the absolute absence of the D antigen. It is a biological blank space. Where the protein should be anchored to the cell membrane, there is simply nothing. From a genetic standpoint, this is a deletion, an erasure of the code required to build that specific molecular flag. When the immune system of an Rh negative individual encounters positive blood, it does not recognize it as human. It reads that common, everyday protein as an alien threat, a dangerous pathogen that must be violently and immediately destroyed. The profound mystery does not lie merely in the fact that a mutation occurred. Genetic mutations are the very engine of evolution. Random misprints in the copying of DNA that happen continuously in the dark, silent chambers of our cells. The true anomaly lies in its survival, in the ruthless arithmetic of early human existence. Any mutation that actively endangers reproduction should be swiftly and mercilessly edited out of the gene pool by the indifferent hand of nature. Yet, this biological blank space did not vanish. It lingered. It took root in a specific, isolated pocket of the ancient world, weathering ice ages, famines, and the slow, grinding march of millennia. As we look backward into the deep fog of prehistory, past the written records of empires, past the stone monuments and the first fires of agriculture, we are forced to realize that the history of humanity is not just recorded in the ruins of forgotten cities. The oldest and most reliable archive we possess is written in the very fluid that sustains us, a continuous, unbroken chain of survival passed from heart to heart across the vast, shadowed expanses of time. In the bitter, gray winter of 1939, as the heavy, mechanized machinery of a catastrophic global war began to grind its way across the European continent, an entirely different kind of conflict was being quietly unraveled in a sterile, brightly lit laboratory in New York City. The world outside the frost-rimmed windows was obsessively focused on borders, on the massive, brutal movements of armies and the collapsing boundaries of empires. But inside the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the focus was infinitely smaller, drawn down through the heavy glass lenses of brass microscopes into a microscopic universe that possessed its own rigid borders and uncompromising laws. Dr. Karl Landsteiner, an Austrian biologist with a brilliant, melancholic mind that demanded meticulous order, had already spent a lifetime staring into the unseen rivers that flow beneath human skin. Decades earlier, at the very dawn of the 20th century, he had shattered the ancient, dangerous illusion that all human blood was identical, discovering the A, B, and O blood groups, and turning the lethal, unpredictable lottery of early blood transfusions into a science of precise biological matching. Yet, even with the ABO system mapped and understood, a lingering, lethal shadow remained in the world of medicine. Patients receiving perfectly matched blood from donors of their own blood type would occasionally, inexplicably, suffer catastrophic immune reactions. Their bodies would suddenly and violently reject the life-saving fluid. It was a silent, biochemical betrayal that made no logical sense according to the known rules of biology. Landsteiner, now an older man working alongside his brilliant younger colleague, Dr. Alexander S. Wiener, understood that the map of human blood was still incomplete. There was another marker, another invisible molecular flag, hidden deep within the cellular forest, waiting to be illuminated, to find a human anomaly. They looked to the distant branches of the evolutionary tree. They began working with the red blood cells of rhesus macaques, a species of old-world monkey. The meticulous, rhythmic process of the laboratory took over. They extracted the primate blood, isolating the red cells, and introduced them into the circulatory systems of laboratory rabbits and guinea pigs. They were not looking to create a hybrid. They were using the highly sensitive immune systems of these animals as biological detectors. When the rabbit immune system encountered the macaque red blood cells, it immediately recognized them as foreign, and it began to manufacture highly specific or targeted proteins to bind to and neutralize the alien cells. These newly forged weapons were antibodies. Landsteiner and Wiener then harvested these specialized rabbit antibodies, creating a concentrated serum. This pale, translucent fluid was a biological key designed to lock onto one specific primate cellular structure. The final, crucial step was to take this animal serum and introduce it to human blood. They drew samples from anonymous donors across the bustling, chaotic streets of Manhattan, placing the crimson drops onto cold, sterile glass slides. One by one, they added the rabbit serum, sliding the glass beneath the objective lens of the microscope, waiting in the quiet hum of the laboratory to see how the unseen architecture of the human body would react to a key forged from a distant evolutionary cousin. What they observed through the eyepiece was a sudden, undeniable precipitation of deep biological history. In the vast majority of the human samples, the moment the animal serum touched the blood, a violent, microscopic storm began. The red blood cells, usually flowing freely and smoothly past one another, suddenly began to clump together. They bound tightly to one another, clustering like iron filings, violently dragged toward a powerful magnet. This process, known as agglutination, was the visual proof they had been searching for. The rabbit antibodies, designed to attack a specific rhesus monkey protein, had found the exact same molecular structure embedded in the human cells. It was a shared biological fingerprint, a microscopic monument to a common, ancient mammalian ancestry. Because it was discovered using the rhesus monkey, they named this shared marker the RH factor. 85% of the human blood samples clumped on the glass. 85% of humanity carry this ancient, widely distributed evolutionary standard. Then came the silence. In 15% of the glass slides, sitting under the bright laboratory lights, nothing happened at all. When the highly reactive animal serum was dropped into the blood, the red cells did not clump. They did not bind. They continued to float in a perfectly smooth, undisturbed suspension. The biological key had found no lock. To the scientists staring through the microscopes, this absence was far more profound than the presence of the antigen. They had not merely discovered a new protein. They had discovered a fundamental physical schism running silently through the human population. They had found the Rh negative blood type. If we allow our perspective to shrink once more, drifting down past the glass slide, past the plasma, and standing upon the very surface of a single red blood cell, the sheer physical reality of this mutation becomes deeply awe-inspiring. A red blood cell, an erythrocyte, is a marvel of biological engineering. It is a biconcave disc, essentially a flexible microscopic bag, stripped of its own nucleus, optimized entirely for the transportation of oxygen. Its outer shell, the lipid bilayer, is not a smooth, empty plane. It is a dense, shifting terrain of complex molecules, towering glycoproteins, and embedded channels. In an individual with Rh positive blood, this terrain features a massive, highly complex structure known as the D antigen. This is not a simple molecular bump. It is a multi-pass transmembrane protein. It weaves in and out of the cell wall 12 separate times, anchoring itself deeply into the cellular membrane. Its exact physiological purpose remains an echo of our deep past, perhaps an ancient ion channel, perhaps a structural pillar maintaining the integrity of the cell as it squeezes through the narrowest, darkest capillaries of the human body. In the 15% of humanity that is Rh negative, this towering 12-lane biochemical structure is completely, utterly gone. It is not damaged. It is not mutated into a different shape. The genetic instructions required to build it have been entirely deleted from the DNA sequence. It is a true biological void. The surface of the negative cell is smoother, missing a piece of architecture that the rest of the mammalian world seems to require. This silent deletion, this structural absence, does not hinder the daily function of the human body. An Rh negative individual breathes the same air. Their blood carries the same oxygen. Their heart beats with the exact same rhythmic force. The absence of the D antigen only reveals its terrifying power when the protective isolation of the human body is breached. The human immune system is a blind, relentless guardian. From the moment we are born, it learns the exact, intricate topography of our own cells. It memorizes every protein, every carbohydrate, every molecular name tag, filing them away in a vast biological registry of what constitutes the self. Anything that enters the bloodstream that is not recorded in this registry is immediately classified as a hostile invader. When an Rh negative person is exposed to Rh positive blood through a transfusion or, as we will see, through the profound, intimate connection of creating new life, their immune system encounters the D antigen for the first time. It does not see a simple, harmless protein. It sees a monstrous, unrecognized biological structure. It sees a lethal pathogen. The immune system awakens, shifting from passive surveillance to an aggressive, total war footing. Specialized white blood cells begin to mass produce anti-D antibodies, releasing millions of targeted Y-shaped proteins into the bloodstream, designed to hunt down, bind to, and obliterate the red blood cells carrying the positive marker. It is a violent, highly efficient biochemical purge. Sitting in their laboratory in 1940, Landsteiner and Wiener had finally illuminated the invisible ghost haunting the blood banks. They had discovered the mechanical reason why perfectly matched ABO blood could still kill. But in doing so, they had opened the door to a much deeper, far more haunting mystery. They had found a genetic deletion that turned the human immune system into a deadly weapon against its own kind. We are left to wonder how countless generations lived, loved, and died entirely oblivious to the microscopic architecture dictating their survival. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans traversed shifting continents, survived crushing ice ages, and built sprawling civilizations, all while carrying a silent, invisible division running deep within their veins. The true weight of history is not always found in the grand, sweeping narratives of empires and kings. Sometimes, the most profound turning points in the human story are infinitely small, written in the quiet, microscopic spaces of what is entirely missing, waiting in the dark for a beam of light to finally reveal the shape of our fragile, fractured past. For thousands of years, the creation of human life was an act of profound vulnerability, a delicate and terrifying biological gamble played out in the dim light of hearth fires, within the thick mud walls of ancient dwellings, and beneath the sprawling, indifferent canopy of the stars. Across continents and across the slow, grinding epochs of human migration, there existed a highly specific, entirely invisible tragedy that haunted a distinct fraction of the population. It was a sorrow that left no physical ruins, carved no stone monuments, and inspired no written declarations of ancient war. It was simply a recurring, devastating silence in families where the air should have been filled with the chaotic, vibrant sounds of a growing lineage. We can look back at the expansive, sweeping map of human history, marveling at the rise of agriculture and the forging of bronze, and realize that amidst those grand, sweeping narratives of collective survival, a microscopic incompatibility was quietly, relentlessly erasing entire branches of the human family tree. To the ancient mind, this repeating pattern of loss was a dark, impenetrable mystery, often attributed to the displeasure of local deities, the presence of a cursed bloodline, or a shifting imbalance in the natural world. They could not possibly look down into the microscopic valleys of their own circulatory systems to see the fatal mismatch of proteins in a biological union between a woman carrying the invisible blank space of Rh-negative blood and a man possessing the ancient, widespread D antigen. The mathematics of human genetics strongly dictates that their child will inherit the positive trait. The very first pregnancy within this specific genetic union is almost entirely an era of undisturbed biological harmony. Deep within the complex, shadowed architecture of the human womb, the placenta acts as a miraculous, highly selective filter. If we were to shrink down and observe this border, we would see a sprawling, tree-like structure of chorionic villi bathed in dark, nutrient-rich pools of maternal blood. This intricate, fleshy barrier allows the vital, life-sustaining exchange of oxygen, sugars, and waste between the mother and the developing child, but it strictly forbids the crossing of whole red blood cells. The mother's immune system, that blind, relentless, and highly efficient guardian of the self, remains entirely unaware that a microscopic structure it would consider deeply alien is growing and thriving just millimeters away across the dark divide. The first child is born, drawing its first sudden breath under the open sky, safe, whole, and completely untouched by the invisible forces waiting in the dark. The profound turning point, the biological catalyst for the sorrow that follows, occurs in the raw, physical reality of birth itself. As the placenta naturally detaches from the uterine wall, the perfect, selective barrier is inevitably torn. In that fleeting, chaotic moment of physical separation, a microscopic exchange takes place in the dark. A fraction of an ounce of the infant's Rh positive blood spills across the threshold and enters the mother's vast circulatory system. The amount is infinitesimal, perhaps no more than a single milliliter, an amount so small it would barely cover the surface of a coin. But in the ruthless, hyper-vigilant realm of cellular warfare, it is a catastrophic breach. The mother's immune system encounters the towering 12-lane architecture of the D antigen for the very first time. It reads this complex protein not as a harmless, temporary remnant of a newborn child, but as an invasive, highly dangerous pathogen that threatens the host. The biological machinery of defense slowly awakens. Over the following weeks and months, the mother's white blood cells, the specialized B cells, begin a quiet, relentless manufacturing process, forging highly specific, long-lasting antibodies designed solely to hunt, bind to, and destroy any cell carrying that specific molecular flag. The true, devastating weight of this unseen biological mechanism falls upon the pregnancies that follow, casting a long, tragic shadow over the concept of a growing family. When this mother conceives another Rh-positive child, her immune system is no longer naive. It has achieved a state of hyper-awareness. It is primed, armed, and waiting. The antibodies she produced during the intervening years are not massive, cumbersome white blood cells confined to her own veins. They are tiny, Y-shaped proteins of the immunoglobulin G class, specifically engineered by millions of years of mammalian evolution to be small enough to effortlessly cross the placental barrier. Their original evolutionary purpose was a beautiful one: to bestow the mother's accumulated immunities upon the developing fetus, shielding the fragile new life from the bacteria and viruses of the outside world. Instead, in the case of the Rh-negative mother, these tiny proteins cross the threshold as a silent, devastating vanguard. They slip into the fetal bloodstream and immediately begin binding to the unborn child's red blood cells, marking them for immediate destruction. The unborn child's own tiny, developing organs, specifically the spleen and the liver, become the sites of a frantic, desperate, microscopic war, attempting to manufacture new red blood cells faster than the mother's infiltrating antibodies can destroy them. This condition, known medically as hemolytic disease of the newborn, was an ancient, relentless tide that swept away countless lives in a slow, suffocating wave of anemia and severe jaundice before they even truly began. Generations of families living in medieval stone cottages, on the wind-swept steppes, or in early industrial cities endured the inexplicable, soul-crushing heartbreak of a healthy firstborn child, followed by a succession of quiet, devastating losses. Entirely unaware of the invisible, molecular conflict raging in the absolute darkness of the womb. In the mid-20th century, as humanity began to map the atomic structure of the universe, split the atom, and push past the heavy atmospheric boundaries of the Earth, the dim, haunting corridors of this specific biological sorrow were finally illuminated by the cold, bright light of modern medicine. By the 1960s, the mechanical, cellular rules of the Rh factor were fully understood. Yet the grim reality of the disease itself remained a terrifying, untamed force in maternity wards around the world. In the bustling clinical environments of New York hospitals, with their sterile white tiles and humming fluorescent lights, researchers began to look at the human immune system not just as an impenetrable defensive wall, but as a system of chemical signals that could be intercepted, manipulated, and deliberately tricked. They proposed a solution that was breathtaking in its counterintuitive, almost philosophical elegance. If the mother's immune system only learned to attack after being exposed to the stray fetal cells during the trauma of birth, what if medical science could artificially hide those cells before the immune system ever had the chance to see them? The researchers, utilizing the deeply sensitized plasma of generous blood donors who already possessed the antibodies, developed a highly concentrated, purified serum. This pale fluid was designed to be injected into the muscle of an Rh-negative mother within a very specific 72-hour window immediately following the birth of an Rh-positive child. It was, in essence, a microscopic, preemptive strike. The injected antibodies would rapidly sweep through the mother's expansive bloodstream, hunting down the stray, microscopic fetal cells and aggressively cloaking their D-antigens. They essentially placed a thick, biochemical blindfold over the invading cells, neutralizing them and safely clearing them from the mother's body before her own immune system could recognize the threat, form a memory, and begin forging its own permanent, deadly weapons. The clinical trials of this revolutionary treatment, which would eventually become globally known as ROGAM, yielded results that bordered on the miraculous. A disease that had silently stalked the human lineage since the absolute dawn of our species. A biological curse that had broken the hearts of millions of unnamed, forgotten ancestors was brought to a sudden, absolute, and triumphant halt by a simple, precisely timed injection of clear liquid. The eradication of this unseen sorrow stands as one of the quietest, most profound victories in the entire sweeping history of human survival. Today, the vials of protective serum sit quietly in refrigerated hospital cabinets across the globe, a routine, almost mundane part of modern prenatal care. Yet, contained within those small, cold glass vials is the culmination of thousands of years of blind, evolutionary struggle and the brilliant, relentless application of human intellect. We no longer lose entire branches of our family trees to the invisible, cellular incompatibility of our own blood. We have learned to rewrite the rigid, ancient laws of our own biology, weaving a protective, invisible net over the delicate, microscopic threshold where one life ends its physical isolation and another begins. It leaves us to wonder about the fragile, unlikely mathematics of our own continuous existence and the countless, resilient generations who walk through the dark without a shield, carrying the heavy weight of the invisible genetic variations that eventually, after thousands of years of sorrow, paved the way for the light where the massive, sun-baked expanse of the Iberian Peninsula slowly grinds against the southernmost edge of the European continent. The earth buckles upward into a staggering, jagged wall of limestone and granite. These are the Pyrenees, a formidable mountain range stretching from the cold, turbulent waters of the Bay of Biscay to the glittering coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. For millennia, these towering peaks and deep, shadowed valleys have acted as a massive, physical barrier, a natural fortress that has dictated the flow of weather, the march of invading armies, and the slow, wandering migrations of human populations. In the deep winter, the high passes are choked with snow, and the lower valleys are draped in a heavy, freezing mist that clings to the ancient forests of oak and beech. It is a landscape that demands resilience, a place where geography itself enforces a profound, uncompromising isolation. Within the westernmost folds of this rugged terrain, straddling the modern border between France and Spain, exists a population that has quietly defied the sweeping, homogenizing tides of European history. They call themselves the Euskaldunak, and the land they inhabit is Euskal Herria, the Basque country. To look at the Basque people through the lens of history, linguistics, and ultimately cellular biology is to gaze into a living, breathing time capsule. Long before the first Roman legions marched across the continent, long before the Celtic tribes spread their iron-forged culture, and long before the concept of modern European nations was even a fragment of an idea, the ancestors of the Basque people were already deeply rooted in these misty valleys. They watched the world change from the high, defensible ridges of their mountain sanctuary. The profound isolation of the Basque people is perhaps most immediately obvious in the sounds that echo through their ancient villages. They speak Euskara, a language so utterly distinct and mechanically bizarre compared to its neighbors that it has baffled linguists for centuries. Almost every other language spoken in Europe today, from the roll-in vowels of Italian and the harsh, guttural stops of German, to the flowing rhythm of Russian and the precise structure of English, belongs to a single, massive, linguistic family known as Indo-European. These languages share a common, distant root, carried across the continent by sweeping waves of ancient migrations from the eastern steppes. Euskara, however, stands entirely alone. It is a language isolate, possessing no known relation to any other living or dead language on the face of the earth. Its grammar is built on an entirely different foundation, its vocabulary an ancient archive of words that predate the arrival of agriculture. When a Basque shepherd calls out across a foggy ravine, the words they use are a direct, unbroken acoustic echo of the Stone Age, surviving the immense, crushing pressure of empires that sought to assimilate, conquer, or silence them. Linguistic isolation is very rarely a solitary phenomenon. In the deep, slow-moving currents of human history, the boundary of a language is almost always the boundary of a gene pool. When a population is protected by impenetrable geography and bound together by a fiercely unique culture, they do not merely preserve their words, they preserve the microscopic architecture of their own bodies. In the mid-20th century, as modern medicine began to map the global distribution of blood types, researchers turning their attention to the Pyrenees discovered an anomaly that was staggering in its statistical weight. While the biological blank space of Rh-negative blood exists in roughly 15% of the general European population and drops to incredibly low single digits in parts of Asia and Africa, the Basque people possess the highest concentration of this genetic deletion on the entire planet. Depending on the specific mountain valley, between 25 and 35% of the Basque population completely lacks the D antigen on their red blood cells. More than a quarter of the people walking these ancient, rain-swept hills carry the silent, invisible marker of the forgotten lineage. This is not a mathematical error, nor is it the result of some mystical, unnatural intervention. The immense concentration of this specific, potentially dangerous genetic trait in one isolated region is a perfect, striking example of a deeply grounded biological mechanism known as the founder effect, compounded by thousands of years of genetic drift. We must imagine a time deep in the frozen grasp of prehistory when a small, isolated band of hunter-gatherers took refuge in these mountains. Within this tiny, fragmented population, the genetic mutation that erased the D antigen was present. In a vast, highly connected world, a recessive trait like Rh negative blood, which requires a child to inherit the gene from both parents to actually manifest the physical absence of the protein, would be easily diluted, hidden beneath the dominant Rh positive genes of a wider, intermingling population. But the Pyrenees were not a wide, intermingling world. They were a closed system. For thousands of years, the mountains acted as a sheer, physical wall against the outside. As the Roman Empire expanded, laying stone roads and imposing their laws across the known world, they largely bypassed the dense, hostile interior of the Basque territory, satisfied with controlling the more accessible edges. When the Visigoths swept down from the north, and later when the Moors advanced from the south, the deep valleys of Euskalheria remained an unconquered island in a shifting sea of empires. Because of this intense geographical and cultural isolation, the Basque people practiced endogamy. They married within their own valleys, within their own villages, within their own fiercely protected linguistic group. Generation after generation, century after century, the available gene pool remained remarkably small and incredibly stable. The hidden, recessive genes for the Rh negative trait circulated silently within families, finding each other over and over again in the dark, microscopic lottery of reproduction. The genetic blank space was not diluted by the vast, positive dominant populations of the outside world. Instead, it was concentrated, amplified, and permanently woven into the very biological fabric of the region. The survival of the Basque people and the astonishing prevalence of their invisible genetic anomaly paints a vivid, objective picture of how the physical earth shapes the human body. The mountains did not merely provide stone for their houses or high ground for their defense. The mountains acted as a massive geological filter. They kept the sweeping, transformative tides of human migration at bay, allowing an ancient, fragile piece of biological history to flourish in the shadows. The high concentration of Rh negative blood in the Pyrenees is a biological monument to endurance. It is the physical evidence of a population that simply refused to be absorbed, choosing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the high valleys over the gentle, assimilating plains. When we look at the blood drawn from a modern resident of Bilbao or a quiet village in Navarre, we are not just looking at a medical classification. We are looking at a liquid archive of resistance. We are seeing the exact, unbroken cellular lineage of the men and women who stood on the snowy ridges thousands of years ago, speaking a language born in the Ice Age, entirely unaware that the deep, isolating silence of their mountain home was quietly protecting a microscopic void within their veins. It leaves us to consider how deeply the landscapes we inhabit carve themselves into our very biology, and how the truest, most enduring records of the ancient past are not always written in crumbling ink or carved into weathering stone, but are carried, warm and unseen, in the steady, rhythmic pulse of the present. 30,000 years before the first stones of Rome were laid, and thousands of miles north of the sun-baked plains where our earliest ancestors first stood upright, the northern hemisphere was consumed by a sprawling, unforgiving silence of ice. The Earth had entered a deep, cyclical slumber known to modern geologists as the last glacial maximum. The world you know today, the temperate forests, the rolling green hills, the meandering rivers that carve through modern Europe, did not exist. In their place sat an unfathomable ocean of solid fresh water, a continental ice sheet that stretched out for thousands of miles, burying the Earth beneath a crushing frozen weight over a mile thick in some places. The global temperature plummeted, pulling moisture from the atmosphere and locking it into towering glaciers that ground their way relentlessly southward. As the ice advanced, it acted as a massive geological eraser, slowly scraping away the living forests and replacing them with a vast, brutal expanse of frozen tundra and howling, ice-choked winds. Beneath this terrifying frozen sky, small bands of anatomically modern humans, often referred to in the archaeological record as the Cro-Magnon populations, were engaged in a desperate daily calculus of survival. These were not primitive, unthinking creatures. They possessed the exact same brain capacity as you and I. They felt the same biting ache of the cold deep in their bones. They possessed the same capacity for complex language, and they held the same fierce, protective love for their children as they huddled around the flickering, life-sustaining heat of a hearth fire in the darkest depths of the winter. Their world was entirely defined by the brutal parameters of the cold. As the massive ice sheets advanced downward from the Arctic, they physically forced all living things southward. The vast, wandering herds of megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the steppe bison, the reindeer, were pushed toward the more temperate zones, and the human hunters, bound to those massive animals for their very existence, were forced to follow in their wake. The geography of the European continent slowly funneled these ancient, fleeing populations into a few specific, isolated pockets of habitable land. One of the most critical of these sanctuaries was the Franco-Cantabrian Refugium, a sweeping stretch of territory that encompassed the southern half of modern-day France in the northern coastal strip of Spain. Anchored heavily by the protective, sheltering valleys of the Pyrenees Mountains. Here, the immediate proximity to the slightly warmer currents of the Atlantic Ocean, combined with the towering windbreaks of the mountain ranges, created a microclimate that was harsh, but ultimately survivable. It became a geographical lifeboat as the rest of the continent froze into an uninhabitable, sterile wasteland. The scattered, fragmented tribes of ancient Europe converged on this narrow strip of land, their world shrinking violently around them. In the quiet, clinical language of modern biology, this immense environmental pressure created what is known as a severe genetic bottleneck. To understand the profound mechanics of a bottleneck, we must look at a population not merely as a collection of individuals, but as a vast, flowing reservoir of genetic possibilities. In a large, sprawling, highly connected population, genetic diversity is immense, and rare mutations remain exactly that, rare, hidden deep within the overwhelming mathematical noise of the majority. But when a catastrophic event, in this case, an apocalyptic, millennia-long winter, suddenly and violently reduces a massive population down to a fraction of its former size, the mathematics of inheritance radically, permanently shift. The vast, deep reservoir of human genetics is forced through a tiny, restrictive funnel. The individuals who survive this passage do not necessarily survive because they possess superior genes. Often, they survive simply because they happen to be standing in the right geographical location when the world froze over. The tiny population of early humans huddled in the caves of the Franco-Cantabrian refugium carried within their veins a random sampling of the genetic markers of their ancestors, including the silent, invisible deletion of the D antigen. In the broader, ancient world before the ice, the Rh negative trait might have been an obscure, thinly spread anomaly. But within this restricted, heavily reduced population, isolated from the rest of humanity by thousands of miles of deadly, impassable glaciers, the specific genetic makeup of those few survivors became the new baseline for everyone who would follow. The invisible blank space on their red blood cells did not provide them with thicker skin or a faster metabolism to fight the cold. It was simply an evolutionary stowaway, a biological passenger that rode through the darkest, coldest chapter of human history, hidden safely within a severely shrunken gene pool. Because this small, isolated group was forced to interbreed exclusively with one another for thousands of years, while the ice sheets held them captive, the recessive trait found itself amplified. Two parents carrying the hidden, silent gene were statistically far more likely to find each other in a population of a few thousand than in a population of millions. And so, generation after generation, while the Paleolithic winds howled outside their limestone shelters, the frequency of the Rh negative blood type slowly, steadily rose, concentrated by the sheer, brutal mechanics of isolation and chance. It took roughly 10,000 years for the Earth's climate to tilt back toward warmth. As the massive, oppressive weight of the glaciers finally began to fracture and melt, retreating slowly back toward the Arctic Circle, they left behind a fundamentally altered continent, a landscape carved by ice and ready to be reclaimed by life. The descendants of those who had survived in the Franco-Cantabrian refugium finally emerged from their geographical sanctuary. As the tundra gave way to returning forests, these human populations began a slow, multi-generational expansion back into the empty expanse of northern and central Europe. They carried with them their advanced stone tools, the intricate, beautiful artwork they had painted on the walls of their caves during the long winter, and, flowing quietly beneath their skin, a deeply altered biological blueprint. The high concentration of the Rh negative trait that had been forged in the crucible of the Ice Age was now seeded across the European continent. It explains, with cold, objective clarity, why Europe as a whole possesses a significantly higher baseline frequency of this genetic anomaly than any other landmass on Earth. It is not an abstract mystery. It is the physical footprint of a localized survival. When we trace the deep lineage of this missing protein, we are essentially tracing the agonizing, beautiful resilience of human beings pushed to the absolute limits of environmental endurance. We are forced to recognize that the biological architecture of our bodies today is not merely the result of a smooth, uninterrupted progression of advantageous upgrades, but is heavily scarred and shaped by the apocalyptic events our ancestors miraculously managed to outlive. The invisible void on the surface of these ancient red blood cells serves as a microscopic monument to those small, fragile bands of hunters who kept the fires burning against the overwhelming dark. They teach us that we are not simply observers of the past, standing completely separate from the deep epochs of the earth. We are constructed from its harshest moments, carrying the cold, unforgiving isolation of the deep past, in the quiet, continuous rhythm of our own enduring veins. As human beings, we are fundamentally, biologically driven to seek out patterns in the endless, chaotic static of the universe. It is a survival mechanism deeply embedded in our cognitive architecture, designed to help us recognize the changing of the seasons, the tracks of a predator in the mud, or the subtle, shifting currents of the rivers that sustained our ancestors. But this relentless, pattern-seeking machinery of the mind does not easily tolerate a vacuum. When we are confronted with a profound anomaly, an unexplainable blank space in our understanding of the world, we intuitively rush to fill that void with narratives. We build sprawling, complex mythologies to explain the terrifying silence of the unknown. And in the modern era, as the invisible cellular deletion of the D antigen became widely known, the human imagination once again rushed in to populate that microscopic emptiness with vast, celestial explanations. In the sprawling, interconnected landscape of modern digital folklore, the absence of the rhesus protein has been cast as something far grander and far more mysterious than a simple biological variation. There are pervasive, deeply entrenched theories that look at the severe immune reaction between an Rh negative mother and an Rh positive child, and see not a tragic, natural incompatibility, but the undeniable signature of two distinct, warring species. They point to ancient, fragmented texts, drawing heavy, shadowed lines connecting this modern blood type to the Nephilim, the legendary giants and fallen angels whispered about in the oldest pages of antiquity. They suggest that this bloodline is a lingering, earthly remnant of a celestial rebellion, a divine, tragic inheritance passed down through the millennia in absolute secrecy. Others look past the ancient texts and turn their gaze upward toward the cold, glittering expanse of the stars. In these circles, the Rh negative trait is viewed as the ultimate, undeniable proof of extraterrestrial intervention in the deep history of human evolution. The theory posits that the sudden, inexplicable absence of a mammalian protein could only be the result of deliberate, sophisticated genetic engineering by an advanced, off-world intelligence, splicing their own alien biology into the raw, unrefined genetic material of early hominids. The biological void on the surface of the red blood cell is reimagined as a cosmic fingerprint, an invisible brand marking a chosen lineage, waiting silently in the veins of millions for a cosmic return that has never come. These narratives are undeniably compelling. They possess a sweeping, cinematic poetry that appeals to our deep-seated desire to be special, to be connected to something larger, older, and vastly more profound than the dirt beneath our feet. They offer a neat, spectacular explanation for a biological reality that historically brought only grief. But the true nature of the universe is rarely neat, and it is almost never built upon the melodramatic narratives we invent to comfort ourselves. When we strip away the layers of mythology, when we turn away from the starry expanse and look objectively into the microscopic, churning reality of our own biology, we find a truth that is infinitely more complex and in its own quiet, unfeeling way, far more beautiful. To understand the actual genesis of Rh negative blood, we must abandon the idea of celestial architects and focus instead on the blind, staggering mathematics of DNA. Within the nucleus of nearly every cell in your body, your genetic code is stored on tightly coiled, microscopic structures called chromosomes. Deep within the architecture of human chromosome number 1 there is a highly specific, intricate sequence of genetic instructions known as the RHD gene. This is the blueprint, the millions of microscopic lines of code required for the cell to successfully manufacture and anchor the D antigen to the surface of the red blood cell. The reproduction of human DNA is a biological miracle of precision, but it is not flawless. Every time a cell divides, billions of chemical base pairs must be copied, unzipped, and perfectly reassembled in the dark. Across the vast, rolling expanse of evolutionary time, involving billions of human beings reproducing over hundreds of thousands of years, microscopic errors are an absolute, mathematical certainty. A cosmic ray striking the Earth, a subtle chemical imbalance, or simply the natural mechanical wear and tear of cellular division can cause a misprint. In the case of the Rh negative mutation, the error was not a subtle change in the instructions. It was a total structural deletion through a known biological process called unequal crossing over. During the formation of reproductive cells, the entire sequence of the RHD gene was simply left out. The code was erased. This invisible, microscopic typo did not require a fallen angel or an interstellar vessel. It required only the relentless, indifferent machinery of biology making a random, localized mistake. But a mutation alone does not create a lineage. In a massive, widely distributed population, a tiny, recessive deletion like this would normally be swallowed up by the overwhelming statistical noise of the dominant, functioning gene. It would vanish within a few generations, a fleeting, microscopic ghost. For this deletion to survive, to solidify into a permanent blood type, carried by millions of people today, it required the immense geological pressures of the Earth itself. This brings us back to the stark, unforgiving reality of the genetic drift and the founder effect. When the crushing, apocalyptic cold of the Ice Age forced humanity into tiny, isolated, geographical lifeboats, the normal rules of genetic distribution were violently suspended in a population reduced to only a few thousand individuals clinging to survival in the valleys of the Pyrenees. The random genetic makeup of those specific survivors became the total, inescapable reality for all of their descendants. The invisible genetic typo was trapped within a closed biological system. Without the vast, diluting influence of the wider human population, the recessive gene bounced back and forth within this tight, insular network of families over thousands of generations through the sheer, blind mathematical probability of small group reproduction. The anomaly became a staple. When we choose to look at the history of our blood through the clear, unclouded lens of objective science, we do not lose the profound sense of wonder. We actually deepen it. We are forced to realize that the human body is a vast, living museum, carrying the microscopic scars and silent deletions of a journey that was infinitely more brutal and precarious than any myth could ever capture. The absence of a protein is not a sign of alien intervention. It is the physical, undeniable evidence of human endurance. It is the signature of a tiny, forgotten band of our ancestors who simply refused to die out when the world froze over, carrying a random, invisible mutation through the dark and out the other side. There is a quiet, monumental dignity in this reality. We are not the engineered pets of a forgotten starfaring race, nor are we the cursed remnants of an ancient, divine war. We are the improbable, unbroken continuation of biology itself, shaped by the harsh winds of the earth, the slow grinding of glaciers, in the silent, mathematical lottery taking place in the microscopic spaces of our own cells. The true history of our lineage is written in the language of survival, a story that requires no embellishment, resting entirely on the awe-inspiring fact that against all the indifferent forces of the natural world, the fragile, continuous thread of human existence simply kept weaving itself forward into the light. For thousands of years, the towering, jagged wall of the Pyrenees held the biological secret of the Rh negative trait in a deep, isolated stasis. The harsh, unforgiving geography of the mountains acted as a secure vault, keeping the microscopic anomaly locked away from the broader currents of human existence. But the human animal is fundamentally, irrepressibly restless. We are a species defined by our overwhelming compulsion to see what lies beyond the next forested ridge, across the dark, sprawling expanse of the next river, and over the curved, unbroken horizon of the sea. As the deep, crushing grip of the Ice Age finally released its hold on the European continent, the vast, sterile sheets of glacial ice slowly fractured and retreated toward the Arctic. The earth warmed, the permafrost yielded to soft soil, and dense, impenetrable forests of oak and pine returned to reclaim the valleys. The human populations that had been squeezed tightly into the southern refuges, trapped for millennia in a genetic bottleneck, began to stretch outward into the newly thawed world. They moved not in sweeping, organized armies, but in slow, meandering, generational drifts. A family moving a few miles up a thawing river valley to find richer hunting grounds, a tribe splintering over a dispute and walking steadily eastward toward the rising sun, century after century. With every heavy footstep laid down in the soft, yielding mud of the ancient continent, they carried the invisible, microscopic void of the deleted D antigen with them. Because the Rh negative trait is purely recessive, it is a master of biological disguise. In a growing, intermingling population, a person only physically expresses the negative blood type if they inherit the exact same genetic deletion from both their mother and their father. As the descendants of the Ice Age survivors began to encounter and merge with entirely different human groups, migrating upward from the Levant and across the eastern steppes, the invisible gene did not disappear. It went deep undercover. A person could carry the hidden, silent instruction for the biological blank space entirely unaware, possessing an Rh-positive blood type themselves, while passing the invisible seed of the ancient mutation forward into the vast, expanding gene pool of the next generation. It flowed through the human tapestry like a subterranean river, completely undetectable to the people whose lives it silently inhabited. In the long, fading twilight of the Neolithic era, and as the blazing, transformative fires of the Bronze and Iron Ages began to burn across Europe and the Mediterranean basin, the speed and scale of human movement fundamentally changed. The slow, wandering walk of the isolated hunter-gatherer was entirely replaced by the deliberate, rhythmic, and relentless march of long-distance trade. Deep, rutted dirt paths worn down by animal hooves gave way to paved Roman roads that cut straight, uncompromising lines across the continent, ignoring the natural boundaries of rivers and hills. Heavy wooden carts loaded with shining ingots of tin, glowing pieces of Baltic amber, and heavy sacks of life-preserving salt rumbled across territories that were once considered impassable wilderness. The people driving these carts through the freezing rain, the merchants bartering in the crowded, dust-choked, sun-baked squares of ancient cities, and the legions of soldiers marching under the crushing weight of bronze and iron armor were all unwitting couriers of an ancient biological archive. The recessive gene hitched a ride on the sweeping, chaotic currents of commerce and conquest. It spread north, crossing the choppy, gray waters of the English Channel into the mist-shrouded islands of Britain, embedding itself in the Celtic populations. It moved east along the sprawling golden networks of the early Silk Road, carried by traders who braved the sweeping winds of the steppes. It traveled south, down the Italian peninsula, and across the vibrant, deeply interconnected shores of the Mediterranean Sea, moving from port to port in the holds of Phoenician and Greek trading vessels. The intense, hyper-localized concentration that had built up in the Pyrenees was slowly being diluted by the sheer scale of the known world. But its geographical footprint was vastly, permanently expanding. The microscopic void was no longer a localized anomaly. It was becoming a permanent, invisible thread woven deeply into the genetic fabric of the wider European and Near Eastern populations. By the time the 15th century cast its long, heavy, and ambitious shadow over the world, the human compulsion to move had reached the absolute edge of the known land. In the bustling, chaotic, and fiercely competitive ports of the Iberian Peninsula, France, and England, regions where the ancient Ice Age bloodlines still ran relatively thick beneath the surface. Massive structures of shaped oak and heavy, wind-catching canvas were being pushed out into the deep, terrifying waters of the Atlantic. The age of discovery had begun, driven by a complex, often ruthless web of desperate poverty, religious fervor, and the intoxicating, highly dangerous lure of undiscovered wealth. The men and women who boarded these creaking wooden vessels spent agonizing months in the cramped, suffocating, pitch-black darkness below decks, enduring the brutal, violent, and unpredictable rhythm of the open ocean. They had absolutely no understanding of cellular biology. They did not know that nestled within the microscopic architecture of their own pulsing veins, they were carrying a deeply localized European mutation across a vast, watery abyss that had physically separated the continents for tens of thousands of years. When the heavy wooden hulls finally scraped against the pristine, sandy shores of the Americas, a profound and permanent biological collision occurred. The indigenous populations of the New World, whose own resilient ancestors had migrated across the frozen land bridge of Beringia deep in the prehistoric past, possessed their own deep, localized, and distinct genetic histories. The Rh-negative trait was virtually non-existent in these vast, complex, and ancient societies. As the subsequent centuries ground forward, marked by the heavy, often tragic weight of colonization, massive waves of both forced and voluntary migration, and the slow, inevitable intermingling of entirely different branches of the human family tree, the invisible gene found a massive, sprawling new hemisphere to inhabit. The strict, geographical isolation of the human species was permanently broken. The silent deletion was passed down through the generations, slowly taking root in the dense, emerald jungles of South America, across the sweeping, wind-torn, and sun-drenched plains of the North American interior, and within the bustling, polyglot cities rapidly rising along the jagged coastlines. The microscopic ghost of the European Ice Age had successfully crossed the ocean, carried in the warm, rhythmic pulse of millions of beating hearts. Today, if you were to look at a highly detailed biological map of the Earth, tracing the exact mathematical distribution of the D antigen deletion, you would not just see a dry medical chart. You would be looking at a sprawling, deeply intimate ghost map of human migration. You would see the highest, darkest concentrations still clinging stubbornly to the rocky, isolated valleys of the Pyrenees, fading into lighter hues across the European continent, and then exploding outward in a scattered, infinitely complex global mosaic. You would find the silent, recessive gene flowing through the veins of a stockbroker navigating the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, a farmer tending to the vast, red dirt agricultural heartland of Brazil, or a teacher driving through the sprawling, quiet suburbs of Chicago. We are a species endlessly obsessed with borders, with the arbitrary lines we draw on paper maps to separate one group of people from another. We build immense walls of stone and steel, and we define our identities by the specific languages we speak, the ideologies we hold, and the colorful flags we raise into the sky. Yet, beneath the very surface of our skin, operating in a quiet, rhythmic, and absolute darkness that completely ignores all artificial human boundaries, our biology tells a profoundly different story. Our blood is a vast, interconnected, and ancient ocean, carrying the microscopic memories of every dusty road walked, every terrifying ocean crossed, and every harsh, bitter winter survived by the thousands of generations that preceded us. We are bound together not by the purity of our origins, but by the chaotic, beautiful, and utterly unstoppable mixing of our deep, cellular past. It leaves us to consider that the truest, most permanent testament to human endurance is not found in the lands we have conquered, but in the invisible, ancient fragments of each other that we quietly carry forward into the unknown. There is a cold, uncompromising ledger kept by the natural world, a continuous, silent accounting of biological success and failure that governs every living organism on the planet. In the grand, sweeping architecture of evolutionary theory, the primary directive of life is exceedingly simple. Survive long enough to pass your genetic information forward into the next generation. The mechanisms that drive this process are entirely blind, possessing no morality, no foresight, and no compassion. Through the slow, grinding process of natural selection, traits that provide an advantage in the harsh, unpredictable environment are preserved and amplified, while traits that hinder survival or actively obstruct reproduction are mercilessly, mathematically edited out of the gene pool. If a random mutation makes a predator slightly faster, it eats, it survives, and its descendants inherit that speed. If a mutation makes an animal profoundly vulnerable to the cold, it perishes in the winter snow, taking its flawed genetic code into the silent earth with it. When we hold the reality of the Rh negative blood type up against this unforgiving mathematical ledger, we are confronted with a staggering biological paradox. We have already explored the devastating mechanical reality of maternal-fetal incompatibility. The absence of the D antigen in a mother can cause her own highly efficient immune system to turn its lethal, microscopic weaponry against her unborn child. In the brutal, unforgiving environment of the ancient world, completely devoid of clinical interventions, sterile syringes, or synthetic protective serums, this immune response was a catastrophic reproductive disadvantage. It was a genetic mechanism that actively destroyed the second, third, and fourth branches of a family tree. According to the strict, uncompromising laws of Darwinian evolution, a mutation that so aggressively targets a species' own offspring is a massive biological liability. It should have been swept away by the relentless tide of natural selection almost as soon as it appeared, doomed to be a fleeting, tragic anomaly that vanished into the deep fog of prehistory. Yet, as we trace the invisible maps of human migration, we see that it did not vanish. It endured. It stabilized in the high, rocky sanctuaries of the Pyrenees, and it flowed outward across continents and oceans to reside in the beating hearts of millions of people living today. For evolutionary biologists, this survival is a profound mystery, an equation that is fundamentally missing a crucial variable. The enduring presence of the Rh negative trait strongly suggests that biology struck a dark, unseen bargain. To offset the terrible reproductive cost of hemolytic disease of the newborn, the complete deletion of the D antigen must have provided an extraordinary, life-saving advantage to the adults who carried it. To find the nature of this hidden advantage, we must completely abandon our macroscopic view of the world and plunge backward into the deep, microscopic ecology of the ancient past. The environment that shaped our ancestors was not merely composed of the biting cold of the Ice Age, the sheer cliffs of the mountains, or the sharp teeth of apex predators. It was a world teeming with invisible, relentless threats. The air, the soil, and the untreated water of the early world were saturated with microscopic organisms, viruses, bacteria, and complex protozoan parasites, all desperately seeking a biological host to colonize and consume. The human red blood cell, floating along the dark, subterranean rivers of the circulatory system, is a prime target for these microscopic invaders. To a parasite, an erythrocyte is an incredibly valuable resource, a floating, membrane-bound island packed with iron, proteins, and the raw, biological materials necessary for the invader to replicate. But gaining access to the interior of a human cell is not a simple task. The cell membrane is a highly secure, heavily guarded border. For a virus or a parasite to breach this wall, it cannot simply push its way through. It requires a specific molecular doorway. It needs to find a structural receptor on the surface of the cell that perfectly matches its own biological keys. If we examine the towering, complex structure of the D antigen, the multipass transmembrane protein that weaves in and out of the cellular surface 12 distinct times, we see a highly elaborate piece of biological architecture. For millions of years, this structure served some unknown, fundamental mammalian purpose. But in the microscopic arms race of disease and survival, even the most vital structures can be turned into vulnerabilities. Scientists theorize that deep in our evolutionary past, a specific, highly lethal pathogen evolved to use the D antigen as its primary mechanism for invasion. We can imagine an ancient, undocumented plague sweeping through the early human populations. Perhaps it was an archaic, terrifyingly virulent strain of a parasite, similar to the modern protozoan Toxoplasma gondii, which is known to interact deeply with the human neurological and circulatory systems. Or perhaps it was an entirely different, now extinct virus that stalked the dark, damp forests of the Paleolithic world. When this microscopic predator entered the bloodstream of an Rh-positive individual, its biological keys perfectly fit the intricate locks of the D antigen. It latched onto the towering protein, breached the cell wall, and began a rapid, catastrophic cycle of replication and destruction, bringing devastating fevers, neurological collapse, and rapid death to those who carried the common genetic marker. In this landscape of invisible, microscopic slaughter, the Rh-negative mutation suddenly transforms from a reproductive curse into an impenetrable biological shield. When the ancient pathogen entered the bloodstream of an individual carrying the genetic deletion, it found an utterly smooth, barren cellular landscape where its intended doorway should have been. The molecular keys had nothing to lock into. The parasite was physically incapable of docking with the red blood cell, leaving it vulnerable to be safely identified, surrounded, and destroyed by the individual's immune system. The genetic void made them functionally invisible to the invading plague. This presents a stark, terrifying view of the evolutionary mathematics that govern our existence. If an ancient pathogen was lethal enough to kill a massive percentage of the population before they even reached reproductive age, the sheer, immediate survival benefit of being immune would mathematically overpower the tragic, long-term reproductive costs associated with the blood type. Biology does not strive for emotional perfection. It strives for the crude, brutal continuity of the species. The survival of the Rh-negative trait may be the lingering physical evidence of an apocalyptic, microscopic war, a desperate biological compromise where the cost of saving the adult was inadvertently paid in the perilous, fragile space of the womb. Modern scientific research continues to gently probe at the edges of this ancient mystery. Studies have cautiously observed that individuals completely lacking the D antigen appear to exhibit differing levels of resistance and susceptibility to certain latent modern parasites, suggesting that the invisible architecture of our blood continues to subtly dictate how we interact with the microscopic world around us, while the exact ancient plague that may have driven this evolutionary bargain remains lost to the deep silence of prehistory. The biological logic stands as a testament to the extreme pressures our ancestors faced. We are forced to recognize that the human body is not a perfectly designed, pristine vessel. It is a deeply scarred, historical battlefield. Every protein we carry and every protein we are missing is a physical record of an ancient life or death negotiation between the environment and our DNA. The mutations that flow quietly through our veins are not merely random accidents. They are the heavy, inherited armor forged in the darkest, most desperate hours of our collective past. It leaves us to consider the immense, invisible weight of the biological legacies we carry, a continuous, unbroken chain of cellular evasion and sacrifice, echoing silently beneath our skin, long after the ancient predators have faded to dust. In the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of modern medical centers, under the steady, unblinking glare of fluorescent lights, a profoundly ancient ritual takes place every single day. The environment is a triumph of contemporary science, defined by sterile surfaces, the rhythmic, electronic beeping of monitors, and the soft, mechanical hum of centrifuges spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. Yet, at the very center of this highly engineered, synthetic space sits a human being, quietly offering a piece of their own biological essence to an anonymous stranger. As the fine, precision-beveled tip of a steel needle gently breaches the barrier of the skin, finding the dark, resilient pathway of a vein, a crimson river, begins to flow outward. It travels through a narrow, transparent tube, warm and pulsing, driven by the steady, unconscious beating of a human heart until it slowly fills a pristine plastic bag. This act of blood donation is completely routine, a fundamental, everyday pillar of our global healthcare system. If we look at that small, dark, red volume of fluid through the vast, expansive lens of deep time. However, we are not just looking at a perishable medical resource. We are observing the physical, liquid continuation of an unbroken historical chain. When that plastic bag is sealed, cataloged, and placed into the cold, heavily insulated vaults of a global blood bank, it joins a massive, refrigerated library of human history. On the exterior of each bag is a simple, white label, marked with a stark, black barcode, and a few defining letters and mathematical symbols. A, B, O, positive, negative. These crude, typed classifications are the modern medical translations of our microscopic architecture. They dictate exactly where this blood can safely travel and whose life it can ultimately save. But within the sterile plastic walls of the bag destined to be marked with a negative symbol, there drifts the invisible, cellular echo of the Ice Age. The donor sitting in the chair, checking their phone and listening to the ambient noise of the modern city outside, is entirely unaware that the fluid leaving their arm is a perfect, identical biological manifestation of the exact same genetic deletion that quietly saved their ancestors in the freezing, isolated valleys of the Pyrenees. They carry the physical ghost of the Franco-Cantabrian refugium in their veins, perfectly preserved and functioning seamlessly amidst the concrete and glass of the 21st century. To fully grasp the staggering reality of this preservation, we must shift our gaze from the quiet hum of the blood bank to the hyper-advanced, microscopic world of the genomic sequencing laboratory. In the last few decades, humanity has crossed a profound technological threshold. We no longer have to rely solely on the aggressive chemical reactions of animal serums on glass slides to understand the divisions within our blood. We possess the ability to pull a single, microscopic human cell into the light, extract the tightly wound, microscopic coils of DNA from its nucleus, and literally read the fundamental source code of our own existence inside the sleek, towering machines of modern genetic labs. The double helix is chemically unzipped, and powerful lasers read the endless, staggering sequence of base pairs, the billions of individual chemical letters that spell out the instructions for building a human being. When the sequencing software scans along the intricate, folded landscape of human chromosome number 1, searching for the specific biological blueprint of the rhesus factor, the reality of the Rh negative mutation is rendered not as an aggressive immune response, but as a digital, verifiable silence. On the glowing screens of the laboratory computers, the researchers do not see a twisted, malformed gene or a strange, alien insertion. They simply see an emptiness, a gap in the text. The specific microscopic paragraphs of genetic code that dictate the construction of the complex 12-lane D antigen protein are entirely, cleanly absent. It is a stunning, objective confirmation of the biological void. To look at that empty space on the digital readout is to look directly at the ancient, microscopic typo that survived the crushing pressure of natural selection, rode the sweeping currents of human migration across uncharted oceans, and arrived safely in the digital age. This deep biological continuity yields an incredible, deeply poetic paradox within the modern medical world. For millennia, the invisible absence of the rhesus protein was a profound, heartbreaking liability, a silent trigger that turned the miraculous process of human reproduction into a deadly, unexplainable tragedy. Today, wrapped in the protective understanding of modern science, that exact same biological void has been transformed into one of the most precious, highly sought-after commodities on the planet. This is most profoundly evident in the rare, specific combination of O-negative blood. An individual with O-negative blood does not merely lack the D antigen. Their red blood cells are completely stripped of all the major molecular name tags. They have no A antigens, no B antigens, and no Rh factor. Their cellular surface is essentially a perfect biological blank slate. Because of this sweeping absence of structural markers, the O-negative red blood cell is virtually invisible to the relentless, hypervigilant security forces of the human immune system. When a catastrophic trauma occurs, when the sirens wail in the dead of night, and a patient is rushed through the swinging doors of an emergency room, losing blood faster than the human body can possibly replace it, there is absolutely no time for the delicate, time-consuming laboratory rituals of cross-matching. There is no time to type the patient's blood or test for microscopic incompatibilities. In those chaotic, terrifying moments, hovering exactly on the razor-thin border between life and death, the trauma surgeons reach instinctively for the cold, clear bags of O-negative blood. Because it lacks the microscopic triggers that would incite a deadly immune war, O-negative blood can be transfused into almost any human being on Earth, regardless of their own specific ancestral markers. The very lineage that was once defined by its profound, deadly incompatibility with the wider population has slowly, through the intervention of science, become the ultimate universal bridge. The descendants of the isolated, forgotten tribes of the Ice Age, carrying the rare, recessive genetic typo of the deep past, are now the universal donors of the modern world. Their blood is loaded onto life flight helicopters, rushed through the dark, rain-slicked streets in ambulances, and pumped into the failing hearts of strangers, offering a quiet, invisible salvation that completely transcends all boundaries of race, geography, and time. It is a profound realization that the fluid keeping us alive is not manufactured in a factory or synthesized in a laboratory. It cannot be artificially replicated by even the most advanced technology we possess. Human blood can only come from another human being. It is an unbroken, continuous river that has been flowing in the dark for hundreds of thousands of years. The heart beating in your chest tonight is simply the latest temporary pump in a sprawling, highly intricate biological network that stretches back to the very dawn of our species. Every single drop of blood currently flowing through the vast, living tapestry of humanity was physically passed down through an agonizingly fragile chain of survival. It survived the crushing, apocalyptic winters of the Pleistocene, the desperate, starving migrations across shifting continents, the sudden, invisible, microscopic wars with forgotten pathogens, and the slow, heavy rise and fall of ancient empires. We carry the physical, cellular archives of those who walked through the darkest nights of human history, completely unaware of the complex, invisible architecture that defined their struggles. We are built from the remnants of their survival, a living, breathing testament to the quiet, unstoppable resilience of life, endlessly flowing forward, carrying the deep, unseen echoes of the past into the quiet rhythm of the present. When we step back and allow our perspective to pull away from the sterile, bright lights of the modern laboratory, pulling back far enough to take in the sheer, staggering immensity of the journey we have just traced together, the complex boundaries of time begin to soften and dissolve. We have wandered through the deep, shadowy valleys of the human circulatory system, marveling at the microscopic forests of proteins and the vast, invisible void of a missing molecular flag. We have stood in the freezing, howling winds of the Pleistocene, watching small, resilient bands of our ancestors huddle around the fragile, flickering warmth of a hearth fire as the world outside was consumed by a suffocating expanse of glacial ice. We have traced the slow, agonizing, and incredibly beautiful drift of humanity across the jagged spine of the Pyrenees, along the dusty, sun-baked trade routes of antiquity, and over the dark, terrifying depths of the world's oceans. We have explored the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of natural selection, the devastating sorrow of an invisible biological incompatibility, and the ultimate, triumphant ingenuity of modern medicine. Through it all, the most profound realization is not merely the mechanics of how a specific genetic typo survived, but the breathtaking reality of what its survival represents. It represents the absolute, undeniable truth that history is not a collection of dates locked away in the dry pages of a textbook, nor is it a series of crumbling, moss-covered ruins scattered across a forgotten landscape. History is a living, breathing, and continuously flowing river. It is carried within us. The deepest and most accurate archives of the human experience are not written in ink, but are encoded in the microscopic, tightly coiled architecture of our own DNA. And they are pumped relentlessly through the thousands of miles of veins and arteries beneath our skin. You are a massive, walking monument to the impossible endurance of life. Every single ancestor in your personal, unbroken lineage, stretching back thousands of generations into the deep fog of prehistoric time, had to survive the ice, the predators, the invisible plagues, and the slow, crushing weight of their own eras just long enough to pass their biological instructions forward. They walked through the dark, they endured the cold, and they kept the fragile chain of existence intact so that you could eventually be here, in this exact moment, breathing the quiet air of the present as the deep, enveloping quiet of the night settles fully over your room. I want you to shift your focus away from the vast, sprawling map of human evolution and bring your attention entirely inward, drawing it down to the intimate, quiet space of your own physical being. Feel the heavy, comforting pull of gravity anchoring you softly to the mattress beneath you. The world outside your walls, with all of its endless demands, its chaotic noise, and its relentless, forward-moving pressure, has completely paused. It is out there, waiting in the dark, but it cannot reach you here. This space, right now, is a sanctuary designed purely for rest, a quiet harbor at the very end of a long, waking day. Listen to the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. With every deep, effortless inhalation, you are drawing in the cool, invisible air, filling the sprawling tree-like branches of your lungs. And with every slow, deliberate exhalation, you are releasing the accumulated tension of the waking hours, letting the physical weight of the day simply drift away into the shadows of the room. Beneath that slow rhythm of your breath, there is another, deeper pulse. It is the quiet, tireless beating of your own heart. Right now, without you having to consciously direct it, without you needing to understand the staggering biological complexity of what it is doing, your heart is performing its ancient, vital work. It is gently pushing the warm, dark river of your blood out through your chest, down the long avenues of your arms and legs, all the way to the very tips of your fingers and toes, and pulling it back again in a perfect, continuous loop of sustaining life. Whether your red blood cells carry the towering, ancient architecture of the D antigen, standing as a microscopic monument to a shared mammalian past, or whether they carry the smooth, biological blank space of the forgotten lineage, the fluid within you is perfect. It is exactly what it needs to be. It is performing the exact same quiet miracle of existence that it has performed in the bodies of your ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. When they lay down on the soft earth, or on beds of woven reeds, or beneath the heavy woolen blankets of a stone cottage, they surrendered to the exact same biological necessity that you are surrendering to right now. The need to rest, the need to let the mind unspool and the body repair itself in the comforting, democratic darkness of the night. As your body slowly powers down, shifting its resources away from the active, analytical demands of the day and toward the deep, restorative processes of cellular healing. The temperature of your skin drops just a fraction of a degree. Your muscles loosen, unclenching from the invisible grip of gravity and stress. The constant waking hum of your nervous system begins to quiet, transitioning from the sharp, focused frequencies of the conscious mind into the slow, rolling delta waves of deep sleep. It is a biological transition, as ancient and as natural as the earth turning slowly away from the heat of the sun to face the cold, quiet expanse of the stars. You have spent the last few hours journeying through the immense, complex history of our species, tracking the silent spread of an invisible gene across the frozen continents and the wide oceans. But as the edges of your awareness begin to soften, I want you to let the images fade. Let the sprawling glaciers of the Ice Age, the jagged peaks of the mountains, and the bright, sterile lights of the laboratories blur into the background. You do not need to hold on to any of this. You don't need to remember anything we have explored tonight. The facts, the science, and the history can all slip away into the quiet dark, leaving only the slow, rhythmic sound of your own breathing and the heavy, peaceful comfort of the bed beneath you. The ancient past has already survived. It does not need you to carry its weight into your dreams. If you're still awake and you've enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, you can gently tap the like button or subscribe. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. Rest well. Good night.